It was a clear September morning in 2001. People were going about their daily routines, boarding planes, heading to work, enjoying the calm before the storm. But by 8:46 a.m., the world would be forever changed. A plane slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
Well, what is that? Somebody hit the World Trade Center or the...
It's a Trade Center.
The World Trade Center.
It's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade.
Just minutes later, another crashed into the South Tower. The Pentagon was struck, and a fourth plane crashed in Pennsylvania. Chaos reigned as the world stood in disbelief, asking, who could do this, and why? But what if I told you this attack didn't happen by chance? What if I told you it was years in the making? A network of extremists, operating in the shadows, had planned every detail of that fateful day. How did they infiltrate the most secure country in the world? Who were the men behind those planes? And what drove them to commit such an unspeakable act? Here's the twist. What if I told you there was a mistake, a critical mistake, that, had it been caught, could have stopped 9/11 from ever happening? A crucial oversight by the CIA that could have altered everything. How did this slip through the cracks? What went wrong? We'll answer these questions in just a moment. This is the story behind the darkest day in American history, the day that would change everything. Stay tuned, because what we reveal next will shock you. We're about to uncover the hidden details and untold truths behind 9/11. It was the late 1970s, a time of geopolitical tension, a defining moment that would change the world forever. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and with it, the flames of jihad were sparked in the hearts of many. But what if I told you that a single man, an unlikely figure, played a pivotal role in what would become one of the most dangerous terror organizations in modern history? The year was 1979, and while the world watched, bin Laden wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a wealthy Saudi, driven by a belief that the fight against the Soviet invaders in Afghanistan was more than just political. It was a sacred mission. With his connections and resources, bin Laden headed to Afghanistan, where he met a key ally, Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian-Jordanian scholar who had his own vision for the future. Together, they formed Maktab al-Khidamat, MAK, in 1984, a recruitment center for the Arab fighters, the Mujahideen, who would join the Afghan resistance. But as the Soviet Union crumbled by the end of the decade, something darker began to stir beneath the surface. Bin Laden's vision was clear. The jihad wasn't just about defending Afghanistan. It was about something bigger. But there was one major obstacle: Abdullah Azzam. Azzam, the mentor and friend, didn't share bin Laden's growing obsession with radical tactics. He believed in a more measured approach to jihad, one that adhered strictly to Islamic law. In fact, Azzam issued a fatwa that strongly forbade targeting civilians, especially women and children. What would bin Laden do? Would he follow Azzam's more ethical path, or would he follow his own ambition? In a shocking turn of events, Azzam was assassinated in November 1989, a brutal murder that left many questions unanswered. Was bin Laden involved? No one knows for sure, but one thing is clear: Azzam's death left the door wide open for bin Laden to take full control of MAK. This was the moment that laid the foundation for what would soon become known as Al-Qaeda. Now, the man who once fought against the Soviets turned his eyes towards something else: the West. Why? In the early 1990s, the world was forever changing. The US was stationed in Saudi Arabia, a decision that enraged bin Laden. He believed the presence of American soldiers on holy Saudi soil was not only a violation of Islam, but a direct affront to the sacred land of Mecca. Bin Laden declared that no infidels should be allowed to set foot on Arabian soil. It wasn't just about the US military presence. Bin Laden's hatred for the West had grown. He viewed US foreign policies, especially its alliance with Israel, as an open attack on Islam. He saw Americans as infidels, and he believed that Israel's treatment of Palestinians was part of a larger conspiracy, one that the US was actively supporting. In 1996, bin Laden issued his first fatwa, calling for the removal of US forces from Saudi Arabia. He didn't stop there. In fact, he began plotting. His next steps would shock shock the world in a way no one could have predicted. But what would happen next? How did bin Laden's network expand? And how did it evolve into the terrorist organization we know today? In 1998, the answer came. Bin Laden, alongside his close ally Ayman al-Zawahiri, declared war on the United States. They issued another fatwa, not just targeting American soldiers, but all Americans, military or civilian. They made it clear America was the enemy. And so, the stage was set. A campaign of terror, violence, and destruction began, with al-Qaeda at its center. The U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania were the first major attacks, setting the world on edge. But it wasn't just about attacking U.S. targets, it was about sending a message to the West. We are coming, and we will not stop. But the question remains, how did one man, with a radical ideology and a network of dedicated followers, come to symbolize the worst terrorist attack the world has ever known? How did al-Qaeda evolve into the force that struck on September 11, 2001. This story is just beginning, and the shocking truth is still to come. The late 1990s, an unseen storm was brewing in the remote mountains of Afghanistan, orchestrated by Osama bin Laden and his trusted ally, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. At the heart of their plan was a vision that seemed almost impossible, taking down America's most iconic symbols. But this wasn't just about destroying buildings, it was about sending a powerful message. The plot began to take shape when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a man of cold calculation, traveled to Kandahar to meet with bin Laden. The two men had discussed many plans before, but now they were ready to act. The plane's operation would be their most ambitious plot yet. The goal, to hijack American airplanes and turn them into weapons aimed at the heart of America. But who could they trust to carry out such a dangerous mission? The answer came from within their own ranks. Young men, willing to give everything for a cause they believed was greater than their own lives. Bin Laden, always focused on the long term, chose men who seemed unremarkable on the surface. They were students, engineers, ordinary individuals with extraordinary resolve. But here's the chilling part. These were men who blended into society until the moment came to carry out their mission. The first recruits, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdar, two young men from Saudi Arabia. They were ideal candidates because of their easy access to US visas, allowing them to travel without raising suspicion. Their mission, to infiltrate the US, learn the landscape, and wait for the orders. But for bin Laden's plan to succeed, he needed a more refined team, men who could quietly slip into American life without ever drawing attention. This is where the Hamburg cell would come into play. In Germany, Mohammed Atta, a quiet student from Egypt, led a life that seemed perfectly normal, focused on his studies, polite, a little distant. But beneath the surface, something darker was beginning to take shape. After a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1995, Atta returned to Germany a changed man, more devout, more intense, and increasingly distant from his old life. Atta's path would cross with Marwan al-Shehi, a fellow student from the UAE, and Ziad Jarrah, a Lebanese national. Together, they formed what would become known as the Hamburg Cell. But they weren't just ordinary students. They were united by a singular purpose, a commitment to radical ideals. In late 1999, after making a pivotal decision, the Hamburg Cell traveled to Afghanistan to train under bin Laden's watchful eye. It was here, in the heart of a distant land, that they would be transformed, molded into warriors with one mission: to attack the United States. The recruits finally met bin Laden, deep in the mountains of Afghanistan. Hidden from the world, they were briefed on their mission. This wasn't just an attack on buildings. It was an act designed to change the world. Bin Laden's words were simple but chilling. This was their moment, their chance to change the course of history. But there was something more. Bin Laden didn't just choose them for their skills. He chose them for something deeper, a belief, a commitment. Mohammed Atta, with his calm yet determined nature, was chosen as the leader of the operation. His comrades, Marwan al-Shehi, Ziad Jarrah, and Ramzi bin al-Shib, were to follow his command. The task ahead of them was clear: train, infiltrate, prepare. Bin Laden also brought in Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdar, two men already in the US, who would serve as critical players in the final stage. Their task was simple but vital: become part of the system, learn the language, be ready for what was to come. With the plan set in motion, the recruits scattered across the world, blending into society. Atta and his cell returned to Germany. Appearing less radical than before, they changed their appearance, avoided extremist mosques, distanced themselves from old friends. But here's the eerie truth: the world saw nothing unusual. These were just young men, pursuing their studies, living ordinary lives. The training for the hijackers would come next, but for now, they were invisible. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. The final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The men, ready to begin their mission, had no idea that, soon, the world would change forever, and the faces responsible were still largely unknown. As they settled into their new lives, their focus shifted toward flight training. Al-Hazmi and Al-Mihdar took their first flight lesson at Montgomery Field, though they only took one session before disappearing. Mohammed Atta, the mastermind, and his fellow hijackers, Marwan al-Shehi and Ziad Jarrah, were focused on their mission. In March 2000, Atta emailed multiple flight schools in the US, looking for training, eventually landing in Florida. In May, Atta received his visa and traveled to the US with his fellow hijackers. They settled in Florida, where they enrolled at Huffman Aviation, a flight school in Venice. But Atta and al-Shehi didn't just go there to learn to fly. They were preparing to carry out their deadly mission. By December 2000, Atta received his pilot's license. Jarrah would follow soon after. Their training was complete, and their mission was about to begin. As the days passed, the men were no longer students. They were operatives, preparing for an attack that would change the world forever. Just weeks before the attacks, the targets were assigned to 4 teams: the US Capitol, the Pentagon, and the World Trade Center, each given code names like the Faculty of Law and the Faculty of Town Planning. The world had no idea, but these men were already set in motion. Their roles were clear and their purpose unwavering. Their final preparations were being made in silence. Earlier, we mentioned the mistakes leading up to the attacks on September 11, 2001. Now, let's break down exactly what those mistakes were and how they changed everything. First, the CIA tracked 2 key figures, Khalid al-Mihdar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, attending a secret al-Qaeda meeting in Malaysia. These 2 men were pivotal to the 9/11 attacks, but the intelligence about their whereabouts and involvement was never properly shared with the FBI. The agency that could have acted on it was left in the dark. This is where the breakdown occurred. The CIA had gathered crucial information about these men, but there was no system in place to ensure that the FBI was made aware. The intelligence that could have stopped the hijackers was scattered, and each agency operated in a silo. The lack of communication between the agencies set the stage for the horror that was to come. On a clear Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001, a sense of routine filled the air across America, but by 8:46 a.m., that fragile sense of normalcy was shattered. American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles, had been hijacked. 5 men armed with box cutters stormed the cockpit. Their leader, Mohammed Atta, forced the pilots aside, turning the plane into a weapon. His target, New York City. At exactly 8:46 a.m., the plane slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, slicing through floors 93 to 99. A deafening explosion followed. Flames and debris erupted into the sky. Below, the ground trembled. Across Manhattan, people stood frozen, eyes locked on the inferno above. Many thought it was a tragic accident, a plane gone astray. But within minutes, that illusion of safety would dissolve. Miles away in Sarasota, Florida, President George W. Bush was visiting Emma E. Booker Elementary School, reading to children as part of an education initiative. At 8:50 a.m., an aide leaned close, whispered in his ear, and told him, "A plane has hit the World Trade Center." Believing it to be a small private aircraft, Bush nodded, calm but concerned. He chose to continue with the visit, unaware that the world was spiraling toward chaos. At 9:03 a.m., terror struck again. United Airlines Flight 175, a second hijacked Boeing 767, smashed into the South Tower. The impact, captured on live television, created a fiery explosion that tore through floors 77 to 85. There was no mistaking it now. This was no accident. This was an attack. In Sarasota, Chief of Staff Andrew Card approached the president and whispered words that would shake the nation. "A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack." For 7 long minutes, Bush remained seated, listening to children read. His face reflected a mix of shock and restraint. Outside that classroom, the world burned. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, hijacked and deadly, crashed into the west side of the Pentagon. The Boeing 757 had been on its way from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles, but mid-flight, it was turned into another instrument of destruction. The explosion ripped through reinforced walls, engulfing the Pentagon in flames. 64 souls aboard were lost, along with 125 military and civilian personnel inside. A symbol of America's military might was now ablaze. As chaos reigned, another tragedy was unfolding. United Airlines Flight 93, delayed by 42 minutes, took off from Newark at 8:42 a.m. By 9:28 a.m., 4 hijackers had seized control, turning the plane toward Washington, D.C., but this time, the passengers knew. Through desperate phone calls to loved ones, they learned of the earlier attacks. They understood their fate and chose to act. Led by Todd Beamer and others, passengers mounted a resistance. "Let's roll," Beamer said as they stormed the cockpit. At 10:03 a.m., the plane plummeted into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The target, believed to be the White House or Capitol, was spared, but it came at a price. At 9:42 a.m., the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, made an unprecedented decision. All civilian aircraft in U.S. airspace must land immediately. Planes descended onto runways across the country. For the first time in history, U.S. skies fell silent. Back in New York, the Twin Towers burned. Steel beams, weakened by the intense heat of jet fuel-fed fires, began to bend. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. 56 minutes after impact, it fell in a roaring avalanche of steel and ash. People on the streets below ran, engulfed in clouds of dust and debris. Then, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. After standing for an hour and 42 minutes, it too crumbled. The iconic skyline of New York was no more. The tower's collapse claimed thousands of lives, leaving a city and a nation forever scarred. By the end of the day, nearly 3,000 souls were lost. Workers, travelers, first responders, families were shattered. The world looked on in horror. President George W. Bush addressed the nation that night, his voice steady but resolute. "Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended." In the days that followed, amid the rubble and ruin, stories of courage emerged. Firefighters worked tirelessly, pulling survivors from the debris. Volunteers handed out water and supplies. Across America, strangers came together, united by grief, by resilience. The attacks of September 11, 2001, changed the world forever. They exposed vulnerability, but also revealed unshakable courage. And as the years pass, we remember, not just the tragedy, but the heroism, the sacrifice, and the strength of a nation that vowed to rebuild. But this is not the end. The tragedy of 9/11 shook America to its core, but it also sparked an unrelenting mission to find and bring to justice the mastermind behind the attacks, Osama bin Laden. How did the United States track him down? What clues led them to his hiding place? And how did USA capture world's most wanted, Osama bin Laden? These are the questions we'll answer in our next video, coming soon. Don't miss it. Subscribe now and stay tuned, because the hunt for Osama bin Laden is a story of resilience, courage, and justice you have to hear. This journey is far from over.